The Paralogisms of pure reason is the first of three parts of the dialectic, I would say the three main parts of the dialectic, in which Kant discusses the natural ways in which reason goes wrong. That is, the ways in which reason, by its very nature, leads us into illusion. Kant summarizes the ways of thinking that correspond to these three parts at the very end of the A version of the Paralogisms on page A397, where he has this little list of three things, the first of which is the synthesis of the conditions of a thought in general, the second is the synthesis of the conditions of empirical thinking, and the third is the synthesis of the conditions of pure thinking. So we are now at one, the synthesis of the conditions of a thought in general. A thought is something that is had by a thinker, right? And that is sort of the basic premise, the basic insight from which the paralogisms, that is, certain wrong ways of reasoning, lead us into what is supposed to be the subject of rational psychology. So rational psychology doesn't really have anything to do with what we call psychology, empirical psychology. Rational psychology is a part of philosophy that tries to get a priori knowledge about the soul. Maybe it tries to show that the soul is a substance, that it is immortal, that it is simple, that it has personal identity over time, right? That it's always the same substance, and so on and so forth. That is what rational psychology is concerned with. And what Kant is concerned with in the Paralogisms is trying to prove that all of that is wrong. It's an illusion. We don't know that stuff. There is no part of philosophy that could be called rational psychology. Or insofar as it exists, it is merely illusion. And so there should be no part of philosophy that is called rational psychology. So what is going wrong? And why do we call it the Paralogisms anyway? Well, that's also something Kant only explains here at the very end of the Paralogisms. So around the place where A398 starts, Kant tells us this. He says it follows from this, that is, it follows from the fact that in thinking in general, we abstract from every relation of the thought to any object. Right? We're not thinking about thinking any object, we're thinking about thinking as such. And we're trying to consider ourselves as the thinking subject, the one who thinks. So this is completely abstracted from the contents of all thought. It follows from this that the dialectical inference to the conditions of every thought in general, which is itself unconditioned, does not commit a mistake in content, for it abstracts from all content or objects, but rather that it is mistaken in form alone and would have to be called a paralogism. And so a paralogism is really just a wrong form of reasoning. So the paralogisms are wrong forms of reasoning. They're not so much mistaken about an object, because actually there is no object here. They are wrong forms of reasoning. And one of the things that Kant wants to do is to explain what is wrong with them. So let's read on again this end, like final part of the A Paralogisms. At A400. Kant writes at A400, now mere apperception, I, is substance in concept, simple in concept, etc. And thus all these psychological theorems are indisputably correct. When I think of the I, right, the concept of the I, it is a substance. That is, I can't say of anything that it is I, right? It is always the I that is like the logical subject, the logical substance, we could say, of some kind of judgment. Like I think about a cow. I think passionately about green cows. I don't actually think passionately about green cows. I feel that I have to sort of make that clear to you. So as a concept, right, the I is always used as a subject. As a concept, the I is simple, right? It doesn't have any parts. It's totally empty, right? It's merely the thought of the unity of all our thoughts, really. So it doesn't have any content. It definitely doesn't have the content of different parts, right? Unlike my concept of the Eiffel Tower, which is definitely about having lots of different parts, the concept of the eye is simple, right? And that's true. It's also, I think the eye is being unified over time, right? I mean, otherwise it wouldn't be the eye, right? But I think all these thoughts across time. That is sort of an analytic truth about this concept. And so if I say things, if I make these psychological theorems, and I say things like the eye is a substance, the eye is simple, the eye is the same over time, all of that is good, all of that is true, Kant says, as long as I'm aware that I am in the realm of the purely logical, right? I am merely talking about the concept of I. But where the paralogisms go wrong is that they confuse the concept of I, as it is given in mere thought, with an object. And they believe that these words substance and simple and, continuous and things like that, that they apply to a particular object that we have just grasped. But we haven't. There is no object there, right? At least there is no reason for us to believe that there's an object there. We don't have access to any object there. And so to claim that I am a thinking substance, like in a real sense, is for Kant completely groundless. There's no reason to believe that. In fact, we have learned in the analytic that we couldn't possibly make that kind of claim because it would involve applying the categories outside of the bounds of all experience. So Kant says, to go on with what I just said, all these psychological theorems are indisputably correct. Nevertheless, one by no means thereby cognizes anything about the soul that one really wants to know. Right? I want to know that I'm immortal. I don't want to know some analytic truth about the concept of the I. I want to know that I am a soul, that I am not material, that I am immortal, that I, all these nice things. Assuming that they are nice. For all these predicates are not valid of intuition at all, and therefore cannot have any consequences that could be applied to objects of experience. Hence, they are completely empty. So, this is Kant's basic idea of what goes wrong in the paralogisms. And maybe we don't need to go through all 4 paralogisms that Kant has in a lot of detail. Kant gives us, and now I'm back at the beginning of the paralogisms, Kant gives us at A344, which is B402, one of these by now very familiar tables with 4 headings, and they have to do with, the table of categories. Except that Kant has switched things up a little bit, right? Roughly, if the table of categories has 1, 2, 3, 4, this is 3, 2, 1, 4. Why? Well, Kant says because all our reasoning starts from the idea of a relation, the idea of us as a thinker having thoughts, right? And so that's where Kant starts with the idea of relation. And under the heading of relation would fall the thought that the soul is substance. Right, having accidents. That was one of the categories, right? In its quality, it is simple. In the different times in which it exists, it is numerically identical. That is, it is a unity. And here, when Kant talks about, he calls this personality later on. This is really what we today call the problem of personal identity over time, right? Am I now the same I as the one who started this lecture, as the one who started reading Kant so and so many years ago, as the one who once played on a little field in France, and I don't know. And 4, which was the category of existence, Kant has this little mysterious phrase, in relation to possible objects in space. Actually, what Kant is going to do here in the A paralogisms, maybe a little bit weird, but he's going to do basically what in the B edition of the book he does in the refutation of idealism. Right? He's going to consider the question of whether we can have certain knowledge about objects in space. And in the B edition, he substitutes a slightly different fourth paralogism for this, although he doesn't go into as much detail over there. Okay, let's take one of these paralogisms, and why not take the first paralogism? So Kant sets out the first paralogism on A348, and I'll just read it out to you. First paralogism of substantiality. That the representation of which is the absolute subject of our judgments, and hence cannot be used as the determination of another thing, is substance. That the representation of which is the absolute subject of our judgments, and hence cannot be used as a determination of another thing, is substance. So again, the thought here is that the subject, right, the I, is the one that has all these thoughts, it has these determinations, it doesn't by itself determine anything else, right? It couldn't determine anything else because it is sort of that which does all the thinking. So no possible thought can be, like, it formally can't fill the logical role, Kant is going to tell us, of an accident rather than a substance. Okay, so that the representation of which is the absolute subject of our judgments is substance. I, as a thinking being, am the absolute subject of all my possible judgments, and this representation of myself cannot be used as the predicate of any other thing. Thus I, as a thinking being, am substance. Right, so this is basically proving that I am a thinking thing. Right, I am a thinking substance. One of the core claims that Descartes defends in his Meditations. Okay, well, what is wrong with this? Kant is going to say that in a sense not much is wrong with it, right? In a sense we have to accept the conclusion that I as a thinking being am substance. And so he says a little further on, when he comes to the criticism, he says everyone must necessarily regard himself as a substance, but regard his thinking only as accidents of his existence and determinations of his state. Okay, so in some sense Kant seems to agree with the conclusion. So what is exactly going wrong? We read on. But now what sort of use am I to make of this concept of a substance? That I, as a thinking being, endure for myself, that naturally I neither arise nor perish? This I can by no means infer. And yet it is for that alone that the concept of the substantiality of my thinking subject can be useful to me. Without that I could very well dispense with it altogether. So much is lacking for us to be able to infer these properties solely from the pure category of substance, that we must rather ground the persistence of a given object on experience if we would apply to that object the empirically usable concept of a substance. So what Kant is pointing out here is that, okay, there is a sense in which I can say that I, as a thinking being, am a substance. But again, this is a purely logical use of the word, from which nothing about any object follows, and definitely nothing that only exists in sort of the empirical category of substance, like my neither arising nor perishing, for instance, which relates this thing to time. Nothing like that could possibly follow from this merely logical use of the word substance. So, he says at the end of this criticism, one can quite well allow the proposition the soul is substance to be valid, if only one admits that this concept of ours leads no further, that it cannot teach us any of the usual conclusions of the rationalistic doctrine of the soul, such as, for instance, the everlasting duration of the soul through all alterations, even the human being's death, thus that it signifies a substance only in the idea, but not in reality. That is what Kant has to say here about the first paralogism. Let's move on to the second paralogism, which claims that we are simple. That thing whose action can never be regarded as the occurrence of many acting things is simple. Now the soul or the thinking I is such a thing, thus the soul is simple. So here the idea is that in the thought of the soul, that the soul can never be regarded as sort of many things working together. And one of the ways to see that is to think about what is involved in a thought, right? A thought has to be a unity. This This thing can definitely pull my arm downwards by every little particle in it pulling my arm downwards. But you can't think a thought by having the different parts of the thought being thought by different things, right? If I ask you to think is cool, and meanwhile I think Kant, we are not together thinking Kant is cool, right? It doesn't work like that. It has to be like in the unity of my I that I think both of these parts of the thought. Kant is cool. And of course Kant is cool. So, does this prove anything? Does this prove that the soul is, that I as a soul am simple? Well, no, Kant tells us. And let's look at A354. And I'm going to read out some passages starting from A354. Here, therefore, as in the previous paralogism, the formal proposition of apperception, I think, remains the entire ground on which rational psychology ventures to extend its cognition. This proposition is, of course, obviously not an experience, but rather the form of apperception. Like, I think is not an experience, it's the form of all my consciousness, on which every experience depends and which precedes it. Yet it must nevertheless always be regarded only in regard to a possible cognition in general, as its merely subjective condition, which we unjustly make into a condition of the possibility of the cognition of objects, namely into a concept of a thinking being in general, because we are unable to represent this being without positing ourselves along with the formula of our consciousness in the place of every other intelligent being. So Kant is sort of claiming that like when I think about a thinking being, I sort of posit myself there, sort of my own grasp of myself, in place of every other intelligent being. But the simplicity of myself is not really inferred from the proposition I think, but rather the former lies already in every thought itself. The proposition I am simple must be regarded as an immediate expression of apperception, just as the supposed Cartesian inference, cogito ergo sum, is in fact tautological, since the cogito immediately asserts the reality. But I am simple signifies no more than that this representation I encompasses not the least manifoldness within itself, and that it is an absolute, though merely logical, unity. Right? So again, Kant is going to insist that like the basic idea of this paralogism, that is supposed to give us all kinds of nice things, right? Like insights into maybe our own, to the fact that we can't perish, because if you're simple, you can't fall apart, right? Nothing like that is going to be able to be done here, because sure, I am simple. That's true. But it's only true in a merely logical sense. Right? I am simple signifies no more than that this representation I encompasses not the least manifoldness within itself. It's my representation of the I, which is completely empty, and being empty is completely simple. And so there's no manifoldness in it, but this is merely a claim about the representation, it's merely a claim about the idea, about the concept. But this representation is not connected to any intuition, right? No object is given to me. Insofar as the I is given to me, it is the empirical subject, which has all these thoughts and feelings and so on and so forth, but the empirical subject is not what we are interested in here, right? And seeing the empirical subject could first of all not give me any a priori knowledge about the self, but also like from the empirical subject, which is definitely not simple, right? It has all these different states. I couldn't infer any of these metaphysical conclusions about simplicity or substance or whatever. Thus, the so famous psychological proof is grounded merely on the indivisible unity of a representation, which governs the verb only in regard to a person. But it is obvious that the subject of inherence is designated only transcendentally through the I that is appended to thoughts, without noting the least property of it, or cognizing or knowing anything at all about it. It signifies only a something in general, the representation of which must of course be simple, just because one determines nothing at all about it. For certainly nothing can be represented as more simple than that which is represented through the concept of a mere something. But the simplicity of the representation of a subject is not therefore a cognition of the simplicity of the subject itself. Right? Let's emphasize that. The simplicity of the representation of a subject is not therefore a cognition of the simplicity of the subject itself. Right? If my idea about something is simple, my concept of something is simple, doesn't mean that the object that would fall under that concept is simple. In part because, here no object is given to me at all. What do I know about it? Nothing. Right? The self in itself is completely inaccessible to me. Okay. I'll finish this video here and then we do another video in which we go and look a little bit more, first of all, at what Kant thinks as sort of the overall problematic structure of all these paralogisms, but also the way that he connects it to his transcendental idealism, the way that he tries to say something about external objects in the fourth paralogism, as well as a brief peek at what happens in the B version of the paralogisms.